Hi, Iman, it's Blackie. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
Okay.
You're obviously returning with the Album One Alive tour. How does it feel to be bringing that over here?
Well, I'll be honest, when we first came up with the idea a couple of years ago, I wasn't sure how well it would be received, and I've been more than pleasantly surprised. The reaction. Being on the inside, it's always hard to tell. You never really know how the world is going to react. But the reaction has been even greater than we had hoped. So it's been really terrific.
It's only the second time, I believe, that you've ever performed an album whole, the other time being The Crimson Idol. They're obviously very different albums. Is the approach the same, or do you got to get in a different headspace, take you right back to those early days?
I don't know if the headspace is any different, but what is different was I was not convinced, and you might laugh when you hear this, but I was not at all convinced that this album could stand on its own. And the reason being is because after you have a number of albums in your catalog, when you go out and you do a show, effectively you're doing a best of set.
Yes. And
so you get to cherry pick the best from all those records. And it's very hard for a single album to stand up against something like that. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, it's been 40 years since we've done this record in its entirety. And I just didn't know if it would work well or not. So we took it in rehearsal and we tried it, and it was okay. And I thought, okay, I think we got some. But it wasn't until we got in front of people that I saw their reaction. And I went, oh, we got a huge fish on the hook here. And you might think, well, how come I didn't understand that? Listen, when you're on the inside of the bubble, you never see what the world sees.
Yeah.
You're insulated, you're sheltered, you never see it. It's kind of like when you make an album, think about, some album you listened to when you were growing up that really had a life-altering effect on you.
Yeah.
You remember where you were at that moment. You remember the setting. You remember who you were with, all those things. You remember all of that when you think back on that record the rest of your life.
Yeah.
When you're the person that makes that record, you never have that opportunity to hear it for the first time. You hear it in little increments when it's being made, but you never really get to have that one moment where you go, oh shit, and you realize you're listening to not just greatness, but, life-altering greatness, social changing greatness,
yes.
That kind of thing. You never get that moment when you're the person that does it, so like I said, you get robbed of that, but at the same time, you get other things too that the public will never see because like when you're the one in the studio making it, you're there when those little moments of magic are born. And that's something the world will never experience. You were there when it was being created. So there's trade-offs. But the concept of hearing an album in its entirety for the first time, to be able to sit down and savor something like that, those are very, very special moments. When you're the one that does it, you never really get to experience that.
There's some tracks there that haven't been performed in years. What was it like going back and playing something like The Flame, BAD, The Torture Never Stops? Was there a little bit of cobwebs there to kind of dust off?
Well, like I said, we went into rehearsal to try it first because we didn't want to make an announcement. And then after the announcement, go on into rehearsal and go, uh-oh, this isn't working. But it was a pleasant surprise. And I'll be honest with you, I was doing an interview and the band was next door rehearsing without me. And I could hear the bleed coming through the wall while I was speaking to the journalist. And they went into Tormentor. Mm-hmm. And I heard that song. Remember what I was just saying a second ago about you never get to hear something for the first time, when you're the one that creates it? Mm-hmm. Well, it took 40 years. But I got to hear that song for the first time that day. And I heard it in a way I'd never heard it before. And I listened to what was coming through the wall and was like, oh shit, listen to this. It blew me away. You know, and I'm speaking now as if it was somebody else that made that record, because it was. So when you do that, like I said, you get your eyes open in a way that it's an eye-opening experience. Let's just put it that way.
I'd never seen the video for Tormentor. I watched it today. I mean, it's one of the earliest W.A.S.P. tracks, really, isn't it?
Well, it's from that first album, but that song was written before the first album was ever done. You know, that's how it ended up in that movie. You know, so, you know, like I said, it was one of the gems that we had early on. But it wasn't until we rehearsed that thing. This must have been 18 months ago, I guess. You know, when we were doing it, and I heard them in the room next to me, and I heard what was coming through the wall. It was like, oh, listen to this. You know, I mean, I know that sounds naive beyond belief, but, you know, sometimes you have to remove yourself from something for a while to be able to hear it with fresh ears again. I
wanted to talk to you about a track that you won't be playing this on the tour, but a song called Mr. Cool. How does it go from being Mr. Cool to Cries in the Night, to redefining a song, rewriting it for the second album? What was the process there?
Well, first of all, that song had a long, sordid history. I wrote it when I was 18. We recorded it in the band Killer Kane, and Arthur did a deal that he ended up suing me over, and he had absolutely nothing to do with that song. But he found an ambulance-chasing lawyer that took on the case and decided to sue me for $1 million, which they didn't get. But you know, it's that kind of stuff. So, and also, additionally to that, all songwriters have songs that they may have early on in their career. To give you an example, like the Titanic Overture from the Crimson Idol started out when Chris and I had that band Sister early on. It was a song called What I Am. And it morphed into what became eventually the Titanic Overture. So all songwriters are going to have things like that in their little toolbox rattling around that maybe they use early on, and they don't really do anything with them, but they look back at them later and they go, okay, you know, I'll tweak this a little here and a little there, you know, and then, you know, maybe it'll be ready. You know, so like I said, all songwriters do that.
Touching on the Headless Children, and it marked a massive line in the sand for W.A.S.P. A big change from the kind of, let's call it the shock rock, the theatrical, into something a little bit more harder edged. What are your feelings on that album looking back to that period?
Well, to understand where Headless came from, you had to look at the history of the band. And we had gone through a period where we had been on the road effectively for about 4 years prior to that. And when we came off that initial run, we didn't know who we were anymore. And you have to really remove yourself from touring to really look around and say, who am I? You know, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? Because if you don't, you're just going to continue to churn out the same stuff you've been doing. And no one can really do that honestly, because whatever record you made 5 years before that, you're not the same person anymore. I don't care what you say or what you do. You change, you grow, you evolve. Every artist does. And so when I got into Headless, I started looking at what was coming out, and I was amazed, my own self, as to see how much I had changed and my thoughts on the world, politics, you name it. You know, everything had been evolving at that point. But when you're on tour, you don't have time to think about that stuff. I mean, you're subconsciously thinking about it all the time. Yeah. But consciously, you're not really aware of how you're changing and evolving. And it's not until you have a little distance where you can stop and kind of catch your breath. And it took me about 6 months really to let the dust settle. And then that writing process started. And I started looking at what was coming out of me, and it was like, whoa, look at this. You know, it's like, I mean, I dreamt Headless, you know, I mean, complete with lyrics, you know, so, you know, and for a lot of songwriters dream songs. So, you know, that's pretty common because they say once a writer, always a writer. You know, you're writing, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're still writing subconsciously. So when you dream them, it's stuff that's been, you know, percolating in your head for who knows how long, you know, so, when those things come pouring out, that really gives you a pretty good indication as to what you're thinking at the moment. And when you've done it long enough, you learn not to question those things. You go with it. Whatever it is, you get on that train and you ride it as long as you can. But I would also say there's a little acoustic thing called the Mephisto Waltz on that. And I wrote the Mephisto Waltz probably 10, 12 years before that, long before WASP. But again, all songwriters do that. They're going to have little nuggets and things like that don't appear a lot of times till later on down the line.
When I was a kid, I'd never heard The Who. When I heard the Real Me, I thought that was a WASP song.
When the record came out, it did really well. I mean, it went gold the first week. And when it went gold, The Who had started touring for Tommy.
This
was in 89.
Yeah.
And so when the record went gold, they were playing Radio City in New York. And I went to the show and I gave Pete his gold album or his gold disc after the show. And we talked for a while afterwards, talked about songwriting and just general kind of things. But he paid me probably the biggest compliment I've ever had. He said to me, it must have taken a lot of courage to remake this song. And I knew what he meant immediately when he said that, because the Who in their prime were this freight train out of control. And it takes a group of really serious musicians to take on a task like that. And he followed it up by saying, he says, but I'll say this. He says, there's been a lot of people do remakes of my songs, but he says, no one has ever done to one of my songs what you've done. And I was I was walking on cloud nine after that. Here's a guy that was a major influence over me.
Yeah.
Turning around, handing me back this compliment now for something that I had done to one of his songs. So that's I don't know if it gets any better than that.
You had Ken Hensley on that album, and his Hammonds really add texture. I mean, what was it like working with him?
Well, Ken was great, and Ken had his own thing. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, he literally had his own sound. And he had a thing that he did with his settings on the B3s that we went into rehearsal, and the first day he hit the first couple of chords on that Hammond organ, and it was him. It was as distinctive as a vocalist.
Yes.
It would be like some vocalist you've been listening to all your life, and they walk up to the microphone and start singing and go, oh, shit. Well, that's what happened when Ken would start to play. And the rig that I have now, as a matter of fact, we bought it. Him and I went together and bought it. We had to scavenge, like the Leslie speaker that goes with it. We went to a separate place and bought that. But he had little modifications that he did on his equipment that gave him his signature sound. I still have that rig to this day. And when you listen to the records today, when you hear the organ on any of the tracks we do, that's Ken's sound.
I make it 4 years between Headless Children and Crimson Idol. By the time it came out, grunge was in the air, alt was in the air. Was that a difficult time to be releasing what was your grand masterpiece?
Well, the timing is everything, right? And I remember from the time I started recording that record to the time I had done the promo and done literally 2 world tours to support it, by the time it was all said and done, it was about a 4-year process. And I came home, and it was early 93. And I remember I picked up Billboard magazine, and I was looking at the Hot 100 singles. And in that list of 100 singles, there was myself with Hold On to Your Heart, or Hold On to My Heart, rather. Sammy Hagar had a song, and Motley had a song. The other 97 artists, I did not recognize one of the names. Not a single one. And that stunned me, because I thought there's been some sort of seismic shift has happened in the time I started making that record. Because you talk about being in a bubble. I mean, when I was making that record, I was totally... most records I make, I isolate myself away. I did it with Headless. I certainly did it with The Idol. And, I'm like a hermit. And so when I come out, from being in my cave for so long, a lot of times there's been some significant changes, but I'm like a man that's been on a desert island for a few years. I am totally unaware of it until I come back into society. I mean, I really do bury myself that deeply when I make records. And I knew I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew something radically had changed, because when I started that record, if I looked at the Hot 100 on Billboard, it didn't look anything like that. And when I came back in early 93 and I looked at that same chart list, it was unrecognizable. Like I said, there was only 3 artists, and I was one of them, that was on it. So it was just like, so let's just take me for a second and just kind of cross me off the list. So there's only 2 other artists on there that I know. I don't know any of the rest of them. And that was real eye-opening.
Still Not Black Enough followed in 1995 on Sanctuary, I believe. Was it a shock to be no longer on a major label?
Well, EMI as a whole had changed all their upper-level management, and there was no one there that we knew anymore. And so we lobbied to get off the label, and they finally let us go. And we had to bend over backwards to give them rights for our records for 10 years after that. But at least they let me go to make records at that point. So that's why, we went with Sanctuary at that point, which is effectively our own label. But, it's one of those kind of things that, no one's career is going to be on top forever. It's not going to be on the bottom forever. It's like a roller coaster. You're going to go up, down, and depending on whatever is happening, socially or musically at that point, there was a seismic shift going on, but there was another seismic shift that was getting ready to happen a few years after that with Napster, and that blew everyone out of the water. So, Napster giveth and taketh away at the same time, and one thing it did do, and as much as I hate it, Napster killed new music, because when we were growing up, if you wanted a record, you had to save your money, your lunch money, you had to work little jobs, whatever you did, you had to save that money, and then you went down to the local record shop, and of the 10 albums that you wanted to buy at the time, that was an agonizing decision to choose only one. So the artist had their sweat equity into the making of their record, but the consumer or the fan, they also had sweat equity in the money that they paid for the music. So there was an equal exchange between the artist and the fans. Nowadays, you don't have that. With streaming, it's like walking over to a water faucet. You turn on the faucet, and it's an unlimited supply. It no longer has value. And when that happened, it killed new music as we know. But at the same time, what it did, inadvertently, is it preserved the music from the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. And it solidified that music, because, when you look at a television commercial now that has contemporary music in it, where do those songs come from? Think about those commercials. It's all either from the 70s or the 80s, because there is no more new music coming that a large audience can identify with. So because of that, it's given us the ability to continue to play live, because the quality of the songs, and I don't mean just us, but I'm talking about all artists that came out of that time period of the 70s and the 80s. If they had quality songs, they're going to be able to continue to play live for a long time. So like I said, the good part was with Napster is that it created a touring world that we could not have foreseen, because if new music would have been able to continue to be made, something new would probably have come along and replaced us all. But that's not happened, and it's not going to happen. So the great quality music that came out of the 70s and the 80s, that's all you have now. So, and when we're gone, I hate to think, what the musical landscape's going to look like.
I wanted to touch on KFD. How's it been to look back on that? Because even, musically it was a shock, not just aesthetically.
Well, I would say throughout the history of my career, that's the most creative record I've ever made. The imagery of that record is pretty remarkable. I can talk about it now because it's been so long. I can look at it with a more objective perspective, and I see it as if it was someone else that, like some other artist that had done it. And I listen to it, and like I said, I look at the lyrical imagery of it, and it's pretty amazing. It's like I said, I think far and away the most creative record I was ever part of.
Helldorado also, and that came in for a bit of a hard time as well. It was almost seen as an overcorrection. What are your feelings on going into Helldorado then? It's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Well, and you are correct in that sense. So what you do is you make records that reflect who you are at the moment. You know, you don't try to follow any trends. You know, you just say, who am I? I mean, same way I wrote Headless, you know, same way I wrote the first album. You know, it's like, who are you at that moment in your life? And if you capture that, they're little snapshots in your life. And if you're successful in capturing those, then you will. You know, so if the world sees it as an overcorrection, okay, fine. But, you know, KFD was a very, very dark record. And if that's what it takes to create that kind of artistry, I don't want to do it again. You know, because to have to go to that space and live there for the year that it takes to make that record, no, I don't want to go back there again. Mm-hmm. So Helldorado was a rebellion, if you like, against what we had just gone through. You know, it's like, we don't want to go back to that place. We don't want to go back inside that pit. You know, it's like, we're out, we're going to have a celebration. And so that's really what Helldorado was. It was a celebration of getting your freedom back, getting your life back.
Bringing things back more to the current times, and it's great to see in your recent live set you have played Forever Free. You've medleyed it in with the Headless Children, the title track. Are they going to remain in the set?
Yeah, it's a little Headless medley that we do in the second part of the show. Yeah, because it starts out with The Real Me and then Forever Free and Headless.
I was listening to the song today again with fresh ears, and I was like, oh my God, that song. It's like they're marching towards their doom. That's the feeling I got. Is that what you were trying to capture with that?
Well, it was a Saturday afternoon, about 5:30 in the afternoon when I wrote that. And I was laying on the couch in the living room, and I was just about to doze off, you know, fall asleep. And they always say you're at your most creative when you're either in an alpha or a beta state, because that's where the conscious starts to relax and the subconscious starts to come out. And just as I was dozing off, I heard, Father, come save us from this madness. I mean, it was there complete with lyrics. And I've had enough experience as a songwriter to know that you don't just lay there and say, oh, I'll write it down when I wake up. No, you get up right then and do it. Because if you don't, it's going to be gone. And I made myself get up, and I'm glad I did, because that was the end result of it.
Just before we wrap up, I have to ask, 10 years since Golgotha, there's got to be some music in the can or rattling around the head. What's happening?
Well, we were working on stuff a couple of years ago, you know, during COVID, and, you know, and then we did the European tour 2 years ago, and the whole thing happened. I broke my back, and it was just one catastrophe after another. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of recording at that point just got pushed way on the back burner, and we've been touring ever since. So yes, there are ideas rattling around, but you know, when you could suspect to see it, I really couldn't say. And then, you know, and I'm working on a book too, so it's like, you know, I've been kind of busy.
Oh, is that your autobiography, or is it a fiction?
Yeah.
When can we see that?
Well, it's about halfway done now, and I'm hoping sometime next year.